Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give a moment for folks to sign on and then we'll get started.
And welcome to this webinar, which means video and audio are disabled. There's just too many of you, but we do want to hear from you. Please drop in the chat where you're visiting from. We were just talking, one of our favorite things about these virtual programs is that we get audiences from coast to coast, all 50 states, all around the world.
And right across the street too. We like people from New York as well. Oh,
Yes, a lot of neighbors as well. Yes.
Near and far. All right, we've already got California, Ohio, Madison, Wisconsin, a few former
Denver,
New Yorks.
Toronto.
Hmm.
Love it. This is what we're talking about from all over. Fantastic. Okay, well, let's get started, everyone. Hi, I'm Kat Lloyd. I'm the museum's Vice President of Programs and Interpretation. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of our Tenement Tuesdays series. This is actually the first program of our season for winter spring, so very exciting. Thanks for joining. And this series, Tenement Tuesdays, is going to be a program series that's entirely virtual for our visitors who are all over the country, all over the world. And the idea of the series is that we take questions that you ask on tours over and over, and we bring our experts, scholars, to come answer these questions in programs. So today we're lucky enough to be with historic preservation expert Andrew Dolkart. Next week, we're going to be with historian Ellen Wu discussing Chinese American history and the model minority myth. And the Tuesday after that, we'll be exploring name changing within immigrant communities, looking at the work of a historian, Kristen Vermadlich. So these programs are really meant to bring you into the conversation. As you know, if you've been to one of our programs before, you are really part of the tours, and everything that we do at the museum is really to explore, what you are curious about, and then be able to share it back with you through our work with historians. So thanks for being here tonight. I'll be in the chat with you, answering any questions that come up while Dolan and Andrew take us through our program and tour. I will pass questions along to them. And also, we'll put some links in the chat for Andrew's book, Biography of a Tenement, which perhaps you've read, but is just out in its third edition. So, yes, I've got my copy here too. We've all got our. So if you don't have yours, and if you were on camera, maybe you're holding it up. But I'll put a link in the chat if you're interested in purchasing that book. We have a special discount tonight. We just use the code Book Talk. And also part of you all being, part of the conversation is, as you support these programs being able to be offered for free, right? That it's through, your generosity and, you tuning in, you contributing, that we help keep these programs free of charge. So if you are able, we are suggesting a donation of $10 tonight, completely up to you, but just by being here tuned in, you are supporting our work. So thank you so much. Look forward to the conversation tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to Dolan and Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kat. And I just want to echo what she said. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for supporting the museum by your presence, by your engagement. And I'm really excited about this series because all of our programs, virtual, in person, we encourage dialogue, we encourage discussion. And this is going to be a fun one for me because when you're leading a tour of the Tenement Museum, you typically say, "Welcome to the tenement. We're going to go see a tenement. You're going to learn about tenements." And you'll inevitably get three or four hands shoot up and say, "Wait a minute. What am I about to do? What is a tenement? What did I buy tickets for?" And so there's no one better to answer that question than our presenter tonight, Andrew Dolkart. So, Andrew, if you're ready, I'm going to pull up the presentation and you can go for it.
Yeah, so first let's start with just me saying some things.
Hmm.
Um, and then we'll go talk about the presentation. So I'm Andrew Dolkart. I'm a professor of historic preservation at Columbia University and a historian of the architecture and development of New York City. And I've been involved with the Tenement Museum almost since it was founded. In fact, about the day after the founders of the museum, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, discovered 97 Orchard Street, I got a call. At the time, I wasn't a full-time professor at Columbia. I was doing I had a consulting business that dealt with architecture and historic preservation issues in New York. And they said that they were interested in establishing a tenement museum, and they thought they'd found the building for it, and they needed somebody to do a history of it. And would I come down and take a look at the building? And I said, yes, I would, despite the fact that I thought that this was about the most boring project that anyone had ever asked me to do. And really writing about a tenement? How interesting could that possibly be? Well, I went down a few days later and I met with them. And the day I went into 97 Orchard Street changed my life. It was such a powerful experience to be in that building, and it changed how I look at architecture and urbanism and preservation issues and museum issues. And so I've been involved. This was in 1988. So I've been involved with the museum ever since. I've written this book about the museum. Actually, it's in its third edition, which is revised and updated edition. And it really has been formative in how I understand the city. So, our question tonight is, what is a tenement? And we're going to look very carefully at 97 Orchard Street. We're going to look at some still imagery, and we're also going to use photogrammetry, which is computer generated and will allow us to move through the space. And Dolan's going to be manipulating the photogrammetry as we go through some of the spaces. But before we start, let me just answer what a tenement is. In the mid-19th century, a tenement, as the city's population was increasing and as more and more poor working class immigrants were arriving, where were they going to live? Well, many of them moved to neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, which had once been neighborhoods of single-family houses. And those single-family houses were converted into multiple dwellings. So instead of one family, you might have 6 or 7 or 8 families living in a building. And somebody who will never know who and will never know when came up with the bright idea. Well, if you could house 6 families in a former single-family row house on a lot that was 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep, if we tear it down and we custom build a building, we can have more families living on that lot. And you can build a building with 20 or 22 families in it. And these became known as tenements. And the New York City government defined a tenement initially as any building that housed more than 3 families, each one cooking separately. And then later they amended it to be any building that housed 3 or more families, each one cooking separately. So basically a tenement is any multiple dwelling that houses 3 or more families. So every luxury apartment house on Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue is by legal definition a tenement. But the term tenement has come to mean those buildings that house the largest number of people with the smallest number of amenities. And so it was housing for lower income, often immigrant individuals. And that has become historically what a tenement is. So that's what a tenement is by legal definition. But what is a tenement physically out on the street or in its interior? So let's look at a couple of slides.
Hey, how's that look, Andrew?
That looks good. So so what is a tenement? So now we know legally what is a tenement. So let's look at the next image. So here's 97 Orchard Street. This is the Tenement Museum. And you can see it in a recent image on the left and how it looked in 1988 about 1988 when it was discovered. It had 2 floors. The basement and the first floor had stores, and the upper stories were closed off. And as you can see, the windows are sealed here because the building made enough money from renting the stores, they didn't have to worry about the apartments in it. So when this building was built in 1864, it was one of the first tenements. It was one of the earliest tenements on the Lower East Side. It was right at the beginning of the movement of tenements, and it was one of 3 buildings that were built together. You can see the building to its right is identical, or it was identical, and the building to its left, which is a little different, they were all built together. In 1863, there was a church on this site. And in 1863, the church was purchased by 3 German immigrants. And in the same day that they bought the church, they subdivided the land into 3 lots. And they tore the church down, and they built 3 tenements. 2 of them were built identically, and the other one was built separately. They were built by working class German immigrants who were investing money in real estate. At a time when this was Klein-Deutschland, it was a largely German neighborhood. And when what's now the Tenement Museum opened, there were 5 floors of apartments, and the basement had stores in it. In fact, the basement had a saloon, a lager beer saloon was in the basement, and where there are now storefronts, there were apartments, and then there were apartments on the upper 4 floors as well. So there were 4 apartments on every floor, 20 apartments altogether on those floors, the saloon in the basement, and 2 apartments behind. So that was 22 apartments. So you can see how, you went from a lot that was supposed to have a single family house into suddenly a lot that's populated by significant numbers of people. The record number in the early 20th century, there were just over 100 people living in this building. It's an enormously overcrowded structure. So let's look at the next image. So here you can see the lot. That's the Second Universalist Church. Originally, it was a Dutch Reformed church. Then it became a Presbyterian church. And then it became the Universalist Church. And then as the neighborhood was becoming increasingly German immigrants, there weren't very many German immigrants who were interested in attending a Universalist church. So the Universalist Church moved uptown, and they sold the lot to the developers. And what you can see is all of the buildings on this plan are yellow. All of the buildings that face the street are yellow. What that means is they were wood. Yellow is always the code for wooden buildings. So these were wooden buildings, and they apparently had masonry, some sort of masonry outbuilding in the rear of the lot. We're not exactly sure what those were, but these were not very substantial buildings that were on this site. So let's have the next one. And here you can see the changing character of the building. That's on the left is a 1940s photograph. In 1940, New York took a picture of every building in New York, and that's a 1940s photograph. The building is, if I'm challenged to say, well, what style is this building? Architectural historians always like to give style labels to buildings. Well, this is an Italianate style building. The Italianate was a very fashionable style at the time. It was very fashionable. Let's go to the next one. It was very fashionable for row houses, for commercial buildings. Oh, wait, we'll come back here. Let's go to the next. Don't we have those images of the? Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Here we go.
Okay.
That's okay. We can go back.
All right. So here we can see, fashionable Italianate style buildings. There's brownstone fronted row houses in Brooklyn, marble fronted commercial buildings in Manhattan. These are fashionable buildings. The commercial building was probably designed by an architect. So let's go back to our image again. Here you can, so here's a building that uses Italianate features. Look at the cornice. That's the element at the top of the building with the brackets on it that projects out. This is a typical Italianate motif. The arched window is also an Italianate motif. So There is no architect for this building that's known. But there probably was an architect, but they just weren't keeping records yet. So you have to ask the question, was this architect trying to design something that was fashionable? And I would say no, he was not. He was building a building to minimal standards. The law required a cornice. He went to a building yard and he bought a cornice. And because the Italianate was the style of the time, he got an Italianate cornice. And so he basically put the building together to the minimum standards of the law. And thus you get a building that typifies the architecture of the 1860s. There were a couple of legal requirements at the time the building was built. It had to have a cornice, it had to have solid party walls, and it had to have a fire escape of some sort. And if you look carefully at the photograph on the left, that's the 1940s photograph, there is not a typical fire escape. A typical New York fire escape has stairways, and you can see that on the image on the right. You can see the stairways so that in case of a fire, you went down the stairs. But the image on the left shows that the building had a fire ladder, so that there was just a ladder that went right down the facade of the building. So this was a fire escape that was not very useful, really. Imagine if you have, 2 or 3 babies and there's a fire. How are you going to get them all down that ladder? Or you're elderly. How are you going to get down that ladder? But this was legal, and in fact, it's still legal if you have a house that has an old fire ladder on it. It's been grandfathered in, and it's still legal. But when the fire escape was there in 1940, but it was not there when the museum acquired the building. And in order to meet current fire code, we put the fire escape back, but we had to do it up to code, which means the stairways here. So it's the same balcony design, but now it meets modern codes. And this is a theme that's going to come up throughout our talk. How did you make this tenement legal for large numbers of people to go inside? And so this is one change that was done, and you can see how it is both an historic balcony and a modern fire escape. So let's go to the next one. So in the back, they didn't even have the fire ladders. Instead, they had fire balconies, which are also legal still. And basically, in case of a fire, you went out onto your fire balcony and it connected to the building next door, and you would, I guess, knock on the window of your neighbor and hope that they'd let you in as a way of getting out of the building. Personally, I would never move into a building with a fire balcony in it because it's just not very safe here. But you can see how there were sort of early attempts to deal with what was referred to as fire, the ever-present tenement horror. By these fire escapes and fire balconies. Okay, next. So the streets were very crowded. The population was very dense. People often refer to the Lower East Side as the most densely populated place in the world in about 1900. But what I want you to look at here is look at how the fire escapes are being used. Everybody's airing their linen out on the fire escapes. This was completely illegal, but there wasn't a lot of space in these apartments. The apartments were often about 350 square feet, and so they made use of the fire escapes to store things, to air out their bedding. As you can see in this, I love this image with those fire escapes lined with bedding, and so what if it was illegal? People were doing it anyway. Next. So one of the great stories about the tenement is how it changed over time. And change began occurring almost immediately after it was built. Sometimes it changed to reflect new laws, and sometimes it changed because the landlord wanted to make sure that they could rent apartments, so they had to make upgrades. The major change occurred in 1905. In 1905, the storefronts were added on the first floor. What had originally been apartments on the first floor with just stores in the basement, they added the storefront. So what you see is a 1905 storefront, and at the same time, they put in this cast iron stoop. The stairway that leads to the front door was put in 1905. That stoop was eventually removed and replaced with concrete. So let's go to the next one. So here's the owner of the building standing on the concrete stoop here, and this is indicative of constant change in the building. But one of the things the museum wanted to do was restore the early 20th century storefront. It's wood that was faux grained to give it a fancier look to it, but the cast iron stoop had been removed. So let's go to the next. So sometimes your everyday snapshot can be our incredibly valuable resource. So here's one of the families that lived in the building, the Rogashevskys, and they're posed in front of the building, but fortunately for us, they were posed just to the side of the stoop. And you can see the original cast iron stairs and railing here. And, using computer-generated imagery, we could blow it up and get the details of it and then compare it to other stoops that survive in the neighborhood. But what an extraordinary resource this family snapshot turned out to be for helping to understand and restore the building. So next. So here, I love this comparison. You can see the restored stoop on the left and the Rogashevsky photograph on the right. Next. Okay, well, we were talking already about the Italianate. You can see the bracketed cornice, the segmental arched windows. On the left, the element over a window is called a lintel. It's the structural element that stops the brick from falling into the window. You can see on the left, those lintels were brownstone and they had deteriorated and they've been shaved back. And in a recent restoration campaign at the museum, they have been restored. And so now you really see the facade very much as it was at the time that the storefront was added. It was restored back to 1905 with the color of the cornice that was there in 1905 and the same window pattern as was there in 1905 as well. Next. So we talked about this, about the Italianate, and so I think we're going to go to the photogrammetry and we're going to go inside the building.
That's right. So I'll pause to see if Kat has any questions to pass on before we switch gears a little bit.
We actually haven't gotten any questions come in yet, but please share them in the chat. I'll pass them along and we'll keep going.
Yeah, so we're happy to answer questions, either Dolan or Kat or myself, or I think that Annie Pollan, the director of the museum, is also on the call, and she might want to chime in also. So when you come into the building, you come into up the stoop and through the front door and into a vestibule. And the vestibule has inexpensive marble walls so that wouldn't deteriorate because it gets a lot of wear and tear in it. And it has and the marble is probably original. The mailboxes were added later, but one of the most interesting features is the floor. I don't know if our photogrammetry will show the floor in the vestibule.
I think if I can move a little deeper, we can see it from a different angle.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll move a little deeper into the hallway.
So the floors were put in about 1905, and they're tile, and they're typical of New York residential buildings in the early 20th century with these tile floors. But I love the vestibule with the star in the center. So in 1905, somebody had the talent to lay the tiles in this to create this really interesting pattern over here. But 1905 is getting ahead of us. We've just walked in, and let's imagine that we're standing in the vestibule as we were a minute ago, and we're looking into the hallway. So there are some original features from 1905 here. The wainscoting, that is the wood along the walls, that's an original feature. If we pull back a little bit or turn around, there's an arch. You're just beginning to see it at the top of the image. See this arch, it's plaster. And that arch with the brackets holding it up, that's a typical Italianate feature. So that's an original feature from the 1860s. The stair rail is an original feature, and we'll talk more about the stair in a minute. And the door on your right, which originally led into an apartment, is the only original door that survives completely intact in the building. It's got 4 wooden panels in it, and it's got a glass transom above that would bring a little bit of light into the hall. Because we're in a period before there was gas in the building, before electricity. So there was no light in the hall. So any light from the apartment might filter out into the hall. So it's so interesting what survives over time. But it got a lot of wear and tear here. And there were efforts to improve it and also to cut down on the maintenance. So the first change that occurred was to the ceilings. And if we look at the ceiling, we can see that the ceilings are pressed metal. They're often called tin ceilings. So they're probably galvanized iron or zinc, and they're pressed by machine in patterns. So they're mass produced. And these were added because the original ceilings were plaster. And gravity has an impact on plaster, and it cracked and it would fall off. And we think that the metal ceilings were probably added maybe about late 1870s, early 1880s. There are 3 layers of paint on the ceiling underneath the metal. So for a while there was plaster, but then they added the tin ceilings. And what's so interesting is whenever they made a change at the tenement, in a tenement, they did it as inexpensively as possible. So they would add metal, and then some of them they might have had a leak or something, and they had to take some of the metal down, and then they needed to patch it. So they just put another different pattern of metal up. So there were multiple patterns of metal that you see, the main one and the patches here. So this was the first change that occurred. The biggest change that occurred was in 1905. At the same time the storefronts were put in, there was also toilets were put in, and we'll talk more about the toilets later on. Those 2 doors that you see over there actually lead to toilets, but they put in the tile floor, and they did something else that was really interesting. They covered the walls, the upper walls that were plaster. They covered them in burlap. They covered them in red burlap. Now, we think of burlap as some crummy material that was used for bags of coffee or things, but burlap was actually, it's actually a very beautiful fabric and relatively inexpensive and very sturdy. And it was very popular in the early 20th century for wall coverings. And so they put burlap on the walls here, and then it's since been whitewashed, but it was originally red, and we'll see in a minute, we'll see a detail of that. But one of the most interesting things is, and really inexplicable things, is then they hired a painter to paint picturesque landscape scenes. Here we are in the early 20th century when over 100 people are living in this aging and deteriorating building, and they put up red burlap, hired somebody to paint landscape scenes, and then ornamented around a frame around it in plaster. What I can only describe as somebody took a tool like a cake icer and created this by hand, rather crudely created this outline around the pictures. This one has been cleaned and restored, so we get an example of what these landscapes look like. I have found a picture of another tenement that had a similar use of landscape painting. So 97 Orchard Street wasn't unique in this. So basically, we can see how change has occurred. So one of the things about turning this building into a museum was honoring change over time. And that was important because waves of immigrants came through, originally largely German, and with a few Irish families, and then Eastern European Jews, and then some Italian families. So both the change in the people and the change in the physicality of the building were absolutely crucial. So not only that, but when this was turned into a museum, it was important that the changes that had to be made to turn it into a museum would be visible. And this is something really unusual in a house museum. Usually, when you go into a house museum, there are sprinkler systems and there are fire suppressant, there are fire alarms, and they're painted out. They're made as invisible as possible. But a decision was made at the Tenement Museum that this was part of the history of the building and they should be visible. So you can see the exit sign here, for example, or if we swerve around, we'll see sprinklers. So there at the top of the image there, next to that window, there's a fire sprinkler, which makes it legal for people to be in the building, and they're visible. So that's a really important thing about this building, that it's about change over time, and not just freezing it in one period. And we'll see when we go upstairs that we will actually time travel in different apartments. So before we go upstairs, do we have any still images here, or should we see if there are any questions?
Yeah, let me switch back over to the still images.
And we do have a
And yeah, anything
question
great.
while we're switching over. Richard was wondering sort of about the profitability of tenements, and were tenements profitable? You know, sort of thinking about landlords cutting corners, looking at the pressed sheet metal and the different patterns. Just wondering about the finances
They were
here.
profitable, mostly because the owners spent as little money as possible on them and then collected the rents. And there are descriptions of tenements that were making a 20% a year return on investment, which was way higher than most building types. And so for the owners, these buildings were often very, very profitable. And related to that is that when change was made, it was almost always done in the cheapest way possible. And we'll see that more when we get upstairs into the apartments. And when the owners were required to make changes, they made them often grudgingly, and they often did them as cheaply as they could.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we have a few still images to accent some of the points that we were discussing. Yeah, so here you can see the burlap, the landscape paintings. I think we have one that shows the red burlap too. I think yes. So here you can see there's the red that was the color of the burlap originally, and it would have been quite vibrant in this hallway with the new floor and the red burlap and the landscape paintings. Do we have any others? Yeah, and there's the door. So all of the other doors, there are many other doors that are actually original, but in 1905, they also cut windows into the doors to allow more light. So most of the doors have glass in them. So I should note that this changes that occurred in 1905, a lot of them are in response to a law, the 1901 Tenement House Act, which required the first law that required changes to be made in historic buildings. And one of them was putting windows in the doors, but they didn't have to do that on this door because it led to a store and not to an apartment. It also required one toilet for every two families, and some other changes that we're going to talk about. Okay, any other still images, or should we go to the stair? Yeah, here you can see here are a variety of the different tin patterns or pressed metal patterns in the building. All right. Oh yeah. So in the one of the interesting issues in this building, and one that's that took a long time to figure out all of the aspects of this, is when various infrastructures were added to the building. So gas was added to the building in the early 20th century, even though gas had been available even as early as the date when the building was built. The owners chose not to put in gas, and electricity was not added to the building until sometime after 1918. And we know that because these are the electric boxes for each apartment, and they have a patent date of 1918 on them. And when the museum was founded, one of the first things that they did was seek out people who had grown up in the building, people that had been children in the building, and a number of people were discovered and they were interviewed. And one of them, Abraham Rogaszewski, says that in 1924, when he entered kindergarten, was when they put in electricity. So electricity had been available since the late 19th century, but instead of putting in electricity in the early 20th century, they put in gas, and then electricity wasn't added until later. So you can see these electric boxes help to tell a story about the building. So next. Okay, so we're gonna go upstairs, and we're gonna look at we're gonna take the stairway up. And when we get back to the photogrammetry, you'll see the stair rail and the newel post, which are original, but the stairs themselves are not original. They wore out. And so what the owner would do was replace the risers and the treads, but save the stair rail and the newel post at the base of the stair and reinstall them. And one way that we know that the stairs are not original is to look at the treads here. The tread is the top part of the stair, and a tread usually sticks out from the riser in what's called a nose. And you can see the nose here was much deeper once, because you can see that little profile there that tells us that there was at least one earlier stair here, and that this one was added later. And at the time they added this stair, they covered it with these cast iron tread panels so that the wood would not wear out as easily. But you have to look for the little details, and they're telltale signs of the history of change and development in the building. So let's go back to the photogrammetry.
You got it. Give me 1 second.
So I see there's a question about who paid for the gas and electricity. The tenant paid for the gas and electricity. When gas was put in, there were meters placed in each apartment that you would put a coin in to access the gas. Well, Do we know about any of the landlords at 97 being active in opposition to improvements? Well, we don't know specifically, but we do know that there was a landlords group that was founded to fight against the 1901 Tenement House Act, particularly the addition of the toilets. And we know that that although the law was passed in 1901, there was a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court and upheld New York City's law or New York State's law, and our owner did not put in the toilets and make most of the other changes until 1905, after that lawsuit was finally completed. Okay, so let's head up let's look at the stair and head upstairs.
All right. How's that look on your end?
It looks great. Can we do the stair? Can we go backwards
I
or no? Or should we stay up here?
think we got to stay up here.
Okay, we'll stay up here. So when you go up the stairs, which has its original stair rail, the first apartment that you reach at the top of the stair is what we call one of the ruin apartments. And it was in this apartment was the first one that I went into that day in 1988 when I visited the tenement. And this is what changed my life. This apartment is so redolent of the lives that have occurred in this building. And I found just standing here was so powerful because you could bring your own family histories to it. And one of the things that I remember arguing when when scholars were getting together to discuss how to turn this building into a museum was, let's not tell a story in the first apartment. Let's have people bring their own memories and their own ideas of tenements into an apartment. And even though, as a colleague, Donna Gabaccia, a historian of Italian history, said, yes, I agree, let's keep this as a ruin, but just remember my grandparents didn't live like this. And that's true, it's a ruin, but it allows us to bring memories. So what you can see here in this apartment is it's 3 rooms, it's 350 square feet. There's a kitchen, what was called the parlor, and there's a bedroom. Only the parlor has windows, and in this case, it looked out on the backyard, and there was another tenement behind it, so it didn't get a lot of light. And you know, it would have been furnished. It would have had 3, 4, 5, 10 people living in an apartment that's this size, and we can see peeling paint. We can see interior windows. And the whole thing just is you can see the structure of the walls where the plaster has fallen off, and it's telling us a lot about the history of the building. So there were 4 apartments on each floor. Originally, as I said, 3 rooms. And one of the things that you could see in these images that are flying by is that there are interior windows. And if we stay right here for a second, you can see we are standing in the parlor and we're looking through an interior window into the kitchen, and you can see a sink, and we'll talk more about the sinks in a minute. And then you're looking into the inner bedroom, and in 1901, the law required that any inner room that did not have a window had to have a window cut into the wall to connect it with a room that did have a window that led outside. And we assumed that all of these interior windows were cut in the early 20th century. So one of the interesting things is we assumed things, and as more and more research was done, we sometimes discovered that we were wrong. And so the first window that you're looking at, the window between the living room, the parlor, and the kitchen, that was cut in the early 20th century. But the second interior window to the inner bedroom turns out to have been an original feature of the building. So And here you can see it. And it was originally a slider. There were a pair of windows that slid back and forth. And how do we know, how did we finally determine that this was original, that this was an original part of the fabric of the building? Well, it was through paint analysis. Paint analysis has proven to be an incredible resource. So experts in paint analysis analyze the paint layers in the frame around the window, and they analyzed the paint layers in the frames around the doors and in the frames on the chair rail and the frame and on the woodwork at the baseboard. And it was determined that there were the same number of paint layers around the window frame of this inner window as there were on the other woodwork, which was a sure sign that it had been there just as long as everything else, and that it was an original feature of the building. So, you know, we're constantly learning things that help us to reinterpret the building. There are places where you can see the layers of paint on the walls, and also layers of wallpaper on walls. I don't know. Do we have any a place? Yes, right over here at the corner, you can see that the bottom layer of paint was blue. The early paints were what are called distemper or calcimine paints, and they were water-based paints, and they were brightly colored. And wealthy people used these paints as well, and they would wash them off every year or every 2 years, and they would repaint. But at the Tenement Museum, they didn't do that. They just covered them over. And so there are layers and layers of paint, and we can see layers of calcimine paints, and then we can see when oil-based paints come in, and when different colors of paint become fashionable. This is giving us insights into the quality of these living environments at the time. And you can see the bits of blue distemper paint. Also, there's wallpaper on some of the walls and on the ceilings. And we can see, especially in the parlor, there's wallpaper on the ceiling. And there's wallpaper on the walls here. And there's wallpaper on the ceiling, and it's peeling off. And we wanted to preserve this apartment in its ruinous condition. Preserving peeling wallpaper is not easy. And in fact, it probably cost more to preserve the deteriorated wallpaper than it would have been to remove it and put on new wallpaper. Because how do you stabilize wallpaper that's peeling off of the wall? So, you know, this was a really interesting challenge for the museum. So this was an apartment. Originally, it had a German immigrant family in it, and then later on there were Eastern European Jewish families in it. And then in the 1930s, the apartments were abandoned. About 1935, New York State passed a law that said that all of the woodwork in public areas of multiple dwellings, of tenements, had to be removed and replaced with fireproof material. And what that would have meant here in the tenement was the stairs would have had to be removed, and the wainscoting in the halls would have had to be removed. And so this was during the Depression. The owner didn't have a lot of money to make changes. Plus, the population of the Lower East Side was declining rapidly. Immigration had stopped basically because of restrictive immigration laws from 1924. Subways were allowing people to move out to Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens. The wages in the garment industry, because it had become unionized, which was where a lot of people worked, were also improving. So people were leaving the Lower East Side. And so the building was not fully rented anymore. And the owner just decided the stores were making a lot of money. We'll just close the rest of the building down. So this apartment here was no longer residential, but it was used by one of the store owners for storage. how do we know that? Because on the on the door threshold and on the wallpaper as well, they took an inventory. And so if we zero in on it, we can see there's pencil writing on the threshold here, and it says things like 25 skirts, 15 pants. They're taking a tally of what they had, and you know, it's a kind of early 1930s or 40s or 50s graffiti that is telling us so much about the building and giving us such a powerful insight into the use of the building. So I think we have some still images that will also help
We do. I was
define
going to
some of these
say,
images.
yeah. So as we pause, any questions in the
Any
chat?
questions?
There was a question just specifically about the paint, of if there was lead in any of the paint layers and what we've done to overcome that.
Well, there's definitely lead in the paint because oil paints all had lead. And I'm not sure, maybe Kat or Dolan can answer that what the museum has done.
We mostly just tell our visitors not to lick the walls.
It's gonna make the same joke if you come to the museum. Thankfully, no one lives there. So,
And the paint is all stabilized, so it's not like there's
Yeah.
paint dust
right.
in the building. So I noted that there was a question about the fire laws, how we meet the fire laws today. So the museum early on worked very closely with the fire department and the Department of Buildings to make it legal for people to go in. So there are all the doors are self-closing doors. There are sprinkler systems. There are exit signs. There's the fire escape. And there's a limited number of people that are allowed in the building at any one time. And so all of those are ways to meet current fire laws.
That's right.
The fire department and the Department of Buildings, worked really well with the museum, and the museum worked well with them because, of course, we want everybody to be safe.
Yes, and we actually added early on, they added an entire exterior metal fire tower, set of stairs, so that you could exit out the back of the building.
Right. There, as I mentioned, there used to be tenements in the back on what's now Allen Street. And in the 1930s, Allen Street was widened, and all of the tenements behind the museum were torn down. And I don't think that when Ruth and Anita found the building, I don't think they realized how perfect the building was going to be because you can exit out the back and then onto a street. And so by putting the fire tower on the back, there's that secondary means of egress that is a requirement of the fire laws. So let's see if we can.
Yeah, heading back to the presentation. And I'll pull up some of the yeah, perfect. Some of the close-ups that we couldn't get to in the photogrammetry.
Yes, so here you can see 6 overcoats, 16 top coats, 44 jackets. It's just wonderful that this survives there. And on the left, you can see one of the sliding windows. Only one of the 2 sashes is intact, but that's an apartment upstairs. Next. So the floors were originally wood, but then over time, people started putting in linoleum, and linoleum will brighten up an interior, and it was probably paid for by the residents. Linoleum, we take linoleum for granted. Linoleum was a 19th century invention, and it's basically linseed oil mixed with cork or some other material, and it's laid on a base of burlap. And there are Persian rug patterns of linoleum at the Tenement Museum, and here we can see a geometric pattern. And if you look really carefully at the edges, you can see the burlap sticking out over here. And we have apartments with layers and layers of burlap, because it wore out, you'd get another piece and you'd put it on top. Or if a section wore out, you'd just replace a little section of the linoleum with new linoleum. So actually, if you look carefully, you can see this checkerboard linoleum, and then below it, there's a different pattern, a different geometric pattern of linoleum. Okay, next. And beginning in the 1880s, late 1880s, people began to put up wallpaper. And sometimes it appears that the owner put up the wallpaper because the same pattern appears in more than one apartments. And at other times, the individual residents, the tenants, seem to have put up the wallpaper. Reformers argued that people should remove the wallpaper. If you were going to put on new wallpaper, you needed to remove the old wallpaper. And the law said that you were supposed to do that, but that was widely ignored. And there are places in the Tenement Museum with 22 layers of wallpaper. And you really get a sense of that in these two images. You can see the layering and layering of wallpapers. And so some of these were probably very inexpensive wallpapers on poor quality paper. Others may have been more expensive wallpapers that were remnants. And occasionally we find quite elegant wallpapers here. And we don't know the full story of how people acquired the different kinds of wallpaper. But we've had a wallpaper expert who's gone through and sampled all the different wallpapers here. And just preserving the layering of wallpaper, really also is really powerful in telling us about the people who lived here. Next. So one of the questions that always comes up is, when was water added here? Water was available in the 1860s. They could have put in water in the building, but if they did, they would have had to pay an annual fee for water. There were toilets in the backyard, and they were connected to a sewer. The toilets were what were called school sinks, and they were supposed to be flushed once a day. But there was no water in the apartments until we think 1905 was when the big sink that you see in front of you was put in. It did not have a faucet, but it was connected to drain pipes. So water would have had to have been carried up from from the backyard where there was a water pump. Here, this is made out of soapstone, and it was quarried in Virginia by the Alberine Stone Company, which is near Charlottesville. And these were very common in tenements. You can see in that last image, if we go back one, you can see a similar sink in a different tenement. This was the cheapest item that the Alberine Stone Company sold. And we know that because in the next image, this is a trade. On the right, you can see a trade catalog for the Alberine Stone Company. And on the left, on the front of each one of these sinks, is this little plaque that announces that it's the Alberine Stone Company Best, their trademark Best, and that they had offices on Pearl Street in New York. So with the name Alberine Stone Company, I found this trade catalog from the early 20th century. And it says, this is our leader. This was their best-selling item. It was also the cheapest item that they sold. And you bought the legs separately. And needless to say, the legs were the cheapest legs that they sold. And so, all kinds of documentation was really important to helping to understand the tenement. Using census records, building records, trade catalogs, so all kinds of government records, election, voting logs, school records, everything to help understand the building and the people who lived in it. Next. So when piped in water was brought in, additional sinks were added. So every apartment has two sinks in it. And this was a sink that was made by Standard. And Standard was a big, still is a big company for bathroom and kitchen fixtures. And this is a cast iron sink with a porcelain overlay. And it's hung from the wall, and as should be expected, this was the cheapest thing that Standard sold. So you can see the owners making changes that were required to be made by law and doing them as inexpensively as possible. Next. So we can go back. We have this on the photogrammetry. Yes, so we can go back to that,
Yes.
and then we'll come back to this still image. So one of the ideas that came up very, very early in the discussion of how to turn this into a museum was the idea that this should tell real stories of real people, not just made up stories. And so this set the museum off in finding people that had lived in the building, using census records and election records and all kinds of other records to understand the people that had lived in the building, and then furnish the apartments, restore the apartments, and furnish them to tell the stories of these people. And so now there are about 9 or 10 apartments that are interpreted in the building. But the first one that we're going to look at is the Gumpert's apartment. The Natalie and Julius Gumperts were immigrants from Prussia. They were Jewish immigrants from Prussia. This was before all the German states merged together. They came separately, and they married here, and they moved into the building in about 1870 with 2 children, and they had 2 more children while they lived here. We're standing in their kitchen and looking into their then we can go from the kitchen into their bedroom. I mean into their parlor. So the parlor. So this tells a story of how one day Julius was a trained shoemaker, but he came to America and custom shoes were not, wasn't much need for them. And he becomes an industrial worker. And one day in 1883, Julius, in 1874 rather, Julius goes out to work and never comes back. He abandons the family. Nobody knew what had happened to him. And abandonment was a known problem in working class immigrant neighborhoods, in immigrant housing. And in 1883, there are court records because Julius received an inheritance from a relative in Germany. But because he was, nobody knew where he was, in order for Natalie to get the inheritance, Julius had to be declared legally dead. And so using those court records, their story became known. And it was also known that after Julius left, Natalie started a dressmaking business in the apartment. And then later, after she gets the inheritance, she moves uptown to Yorkville, which was a more modern German neighborhood. And so using these stories, this apartment was furnished with she was living here with her children. She was running her dress business here. And so this what we're seeing here tells us a number of stories. First of all, this was the first apartment that was done, and everything was not done correctly. What was learned was that the woodwork had been grained, That is, it had been faux grained to make it look a little fancier than it was. So they've grained the doors and the chair rail and the woodwork. So that was something that was done as part of the restoration. One thing that was amazing to have found out that we had no idea about was that they were doing some scraping on the ceiling, and they discovered on the ceiling that the wall between the kitchen and the parlor had been moved at one point. And so you can see the ghost of that. And the original meant that, that this is the original large parlor and small kitchen. But when we think in 1905, when water was added and they needed room for the sink, they shrunk the parlor and increased the size of the kitchen. So we have the ghost of that, and you can see there's some fancy stenciling on the ceiling also that was done at this time when it was smaller. But the big mistake that was made was they put wallpaper on the walls, and later research determined that during the period when the Gumpertzes lived here, there was no wallpaper. Wallpaper did not begin to be added until the 1880s. And so, so we learn things here. And so, the apartment is interpreted to tell the Gumpertz story, but it was a little bit fancier than Natalie and her children would have known. So before we go back to the still images and we see what has happened to this apartment, just let me note that you never know when somebody with knowledge is going to come on a tour. And it was a big mystery what had happened to Julius Gumpertz. But some people from Cincinnati came on the tour, and they said they knew what had happened to Julius. He had moved to Cincinnati and became a peddler. And he died in the Jewish Home for the Aged in Cincinnati. And he claimed that he was unmarried. And so now we know what Natalie didn't know was what happened to Julius Gumpertz after he abandoned the family. So let's go back to the still images.
Andrew, real quick before we back up out of Gumpertz, I do have to ask you this. Our most frequent visitor question probably is not going to get its own Tenement Tuesday, but it is what we can see right now. Is that a fireplace?
Yes, it is. And I have to say, this is a mystery, a little bit of a mystery too. These are original. There are original mantles. They're wood, and they're very, very simple. And were they used? I don't think they were used very much. There was a stove in the kitchen. The stove. Some writers in the 19th century claim that the stoves were owned by the residents, by the tenants. But I think that wasn't, that a lot of these apartments probably came with the stove, and they weren't the property of the tenant. The stove probably was enough to heat the apartment, because the apartments are relatively small. What I would love to see someday is to have the flues scraped to find out just how much debris is in the flues to tell us how much they were used, but we have not gotten around to doing that. So it wasn't like they had a wood burning stove and the family sat around reading books around the fireplace. But why, you have to ask the question of why in a tenement were there these fireplaces. And I think that the mantle meant home, and you needed to rent these apartments. In order for these to become profitable, they needed to be fully rented. And so the symbol of hominess I think is really important to think of these as home. And I think it's a really important notion that no matter how deteriorated the building was, how maybe the wallpaper was a little worn out or there were stains on the wall, people made this home. And so if there was a stain on the wall, you hung a picture on top of the stain and you hid it. Uh, and we all do that still today. I remember my first apartment when I was a graduate student in Manhattan. The walls were all cracked and a mess, and I actually hung burlap on the walls, and it was beautiful. And in another room, we just hung pictures over areas that were a little bit deteriorated. So, Dolan, do you want to talk about the ventilation now, or do in a minute?
Sure. I was just noting, time-wise, it's up to you, but do you want to jump ahead a little bit so we can do the photogrammetry of the last apartment?
Okay, let's let's can we just go back to the stills for a minute because I want
Yes.
to finish the story of the wallpaper.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I always objected to having the wallpaper there, and I was so delighted when in the recent restoration work on the building, which included a ventilation system and improved windows, a decision was made to take this wallpaper out. Uh, and so if we go to the next image, oh, well, here's the details on the ceiling. This is what it looks like today. Using the blue distemper paints, it turns out that the graining was somewhat lighter in color than we had originally thought. And so it was regrained in that lighter shade here. But we don't want to forget the history because the mistakes are part of the history of the building. So if you go to the next image, underneath, behind the door, a piece of the wallpaper has been preserved. So we can tell the whole story of how the museum has evolved over time. Okay, so let's go to the final apartment that we're going to look at, which is the Baldizzi apartment. Josephine Baldizzi was a child in the building, and she was one of the people that was discovered and interviewed, and she became very active at the museum. And if you come on a tour of the Baldizzi apartment, you'll hear a tape of her speaking. And her apartment is now on the second floor because it was one of the first two apartments that were opened, and we opened one floor at a time. She actually lived on the third floor. So it recreates her apartment in the same group of apartments, but one floor down. So this is we have now time traveled. We've gone from the Gumpertzes in the 1870s to the Baldizzis in the 1930s on the day they're packing up to move out of the apartment because the apartment is being emptied. And so that's one of the unique aspects of the Tenement Museum is that you time travel. So here we are in an apartment that's been recreated, often according to what Josephine talked about. She noted that the family was devout Catholics, and there are some Catholic imagery on some of the walls. They were huge fans of Franklin D. Roosevelt, so there's a portrait of Roosevelt on the wall. They had morning glories on. Her father was very proud of the morning glories that were in the window, and so there are morning glories, plastic morning glories, growing in our windows. There you can see there's a Madonna, and there's FDR, and there's the morning glories, and it's furnished with inexpensive things of the type that Josephine noted that they had here. This is an apartment that's even smaller than the ones we've looked at because of the addition of the toilets in 1905. It shrunk half of the apartments, so the room sizes got smaller, so this is about 250 square feet in this apartment. So one of the most interesting things was that Josephine's father was a carpenter, and he decided to both beautify the apartment and make it more utilitarian. And so he built a kitchen cabinet, which you can see here, just to the left of the stove. This was made by Josephine's father. And it was it survived in the apartment on the third floor. And the museum removed it from the third floor and inserted it into the second floor here to really associate it closely with the Baldizis. So I think that what we're seeing is that there are so many things to learn, and there are so many ways to learn it. So that a tenement, I defined a tenement, but that's a legal definition. And a tenement was a place where people lived, where working class people lived, where people struggled, and they made their lives as beautiful and as successful as possible. And of course, these were immigrants whose succeeding generations often became incredibly successful in America, and they became what America is. And it's the immigrant story, and it's a story that continues today, although of course politically it's very fraught today. But it was very fraught in the late 19th and early 20th century. A lot of anti-immigrant sentiment that led to the restrictive immigration laws in 1924. So, we see how history repeats itself, and tenement lives repeat themselves here. So I think I'll stop here. And if there's anything you guys want to add, or any more questions that we have.
I think that's a beautiful place to end, actually, Andrew, is thinking about everything we can learn from this tenement, but broadly from people who lived in tenements, from tenement stories, past and present. And we have a couple of programs coming up where you can continue to learn about the lives of people who lived and live in tenements. And actually, to Andrew's last note, just in 2 days, this Thursday, the 22nd, we have a program that will be live streamed about immigration today. So looking at immigration today, but in context of what was going on, what people were thinking about immigrants and immigration in the past. That program will be our president, Dr. Annie Polland, in conversation with Caitlin Dickerson, the Atlantic journalist, and Muz Chishti, who's an immigration policy expert. So that's Thursday. And then next week on Tuesday, we have our next in our series of the Tenement Tuesdays with Dr. Ellen Wu exploring ideas about the model minority myth. So please join us for Tenement Tuesdays, for any of our other live streamed or in-person programs. If you are in New York, and come see us for a tour. And thank you all so much for joining tonight. As you have seen many times over in this program, your questions are what fuel our work. And you are part of these tours and these stories too. So thank you so much, and hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day or night wherever you are in the world.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
All
Hope to see
right.
you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.